So we're talking about now the creation of my facade. It's so good to know. It is good to know, isn't it? Yep. And one of the things the first group found out with this particular discussion was that they started to have a bit more compassion for themselves. You know, a lot of us are pretty hard on ourselves, and we have a huge amount of judgment of our facade, not understanding the terrible decisions that were made, some of them by others and some of them by us, that have actually caused our facade to come into being. So let's examine this question of the creation of my facade. The first thing we need to say is that I was taught to fear pain. If you were never taught to fear pain, you would never have created what's on top of it. How simple would that be? We just would feel it. It's the teaching that we need to fear pain that created everything that's on top of our pain. So this fearing of pain is a major issue for us. The fear of pain. The desire to just get pleasure and to avoid pain at all costs. If one of the single most important decisions that you are going to be faced with on your road to the recovery of your true self is going to be the decision to choose to feel pain rather than fear it. Just that one decision is going to change your life. But that one decision has to be made as a soul-based decision. It can't be made willpowering with your intellect through it. It actually has to be a choice made inside of your soul, a feeling-based choice. Just that one decision will absolutely change your life. So it's interesting, isn't it? One choice made to create our facade, one choice made, and we have a large effect on the deconstruction of the facade. So let's have a look at this teaching, this really bad, false teaching, very destructive. It begins with our parents. And what our parents did was that they had a whole lot of internal pain inside of themselves. And so what they've decided to do with this pain is they decided to suppress it, to control it, to keep it under cover, keep it under wraps, to only go for pleasure and to avoid pain. In that choice that they made, they were a living example to you. So this is the first thing. My parents' example was the first decision they made. So they modelled to you the behaviour. They modelled to you the terror that they felt inside of themselves, that pain should be avoided at all costs. And they modelled all of the actions that they took as a subsequent result to do that were all modelled to you. And you as a child didn't have an intellectual cognizance to be able to determine or differentiate between what they were doing and whether it was right or not. You didn't have a formulated intellect at that stage. You had no way of preventing yourself from being infected by this one terrible event. And when I say one terrible event, it's one terrible attitude that probably got infected by many thousands of events. Right. So here we are, the child, and the poor unfortunate child. Unfortunately, you've got a soul, your soul, of which you're a half, of course, but you've got your soul, you've got your parents, and their attitude, their feelings We're imposed upon this child, the soul of the child, and maybe what we need to do, instead of drawing it that large, we'll draw it as you were, a little baby. Spirit body, physical body, half of your soul. Your parents modelled to you by their feelings about pain. So their feelings about pain entered you. And remember, the child, because it does not have this whole, remember we discussed right at the beginning, this whole communication thing where we've got, two people communicating. They've got heart, mind, language, mind, heart. Remember that cycle? Well, the child is used to doing this. The child was built to do that, in fact. But it has no way of determining what are valid or truthful emotions or not. It has no way of determining what God's truth is at that undeveloped stage. And so what happens is any of the parents' decisions and choices that were made from an emotional perspective got imposed upon the child. So because the parents chose to not release their pain and chose instead to create this whole castle of a facade, and these feelings about their fear of pain are now within the parents inside of their soul as an emotion, this emotion got transmitted to the child. And the reason why you're so terrified is because you have no idea where this emotion came from. You just absorbed the emotion of terror without understanding where it came from. So now all of you are terrified about feeling emotion, feeling pain. Terrified, literally terrified. So that's number one. We need to understand that. We need to have compassion. You need to have compassion for yourself, that there's nothing that you could have done about that. It's only your parents who had control over it at that point. Dennis? We just have next page.
Is that why we strive so vehemently to understand our emotions?
Yes, a lot of what we see, a child by nature doesn't try to understand its emotions, it experiences its emotions. Before it even knows what they are, it's experiencing them. As adults, we try to understand because we're driven by this terror of them. We are terrified of emotions generally. And even many of your questions over the last 8 years have been driven by your terror of emotion. That's why when we get into a subject matter of some kind and we start discussing God's laws or God's feelings about this, and we start discussing wonderful things, will and other faith and other things like that, it always seems to revert back to a question and answer about emotions. And why is that? Because of this problem. Because you're terrified of actually feeling an emotion. And so it actually prevents me from sharing with you more of God's truth. Because you're so terrified that all you can ask about is emotion. Does that make sense? Mm. And it causes a major problem to our learning and our capacity to feel, because we're actually so terrified of feeling that we're trying to prevent almost every feeling we have. And almost every question is driven by our desire to prevent the feeling of emotion. So we're driven, it's an addiction to prevent emotion. Yeah, it's a big problem. And if you examine, if you do go back over the last 8 or 9 years since many of you have known us, the majority of your questions have been emotion-based questions. You look at our Q&A list on the FAQ list on our website. The biggest FAQ list is about emotions. We got 7 or 8 sessions there already. The reason why is the majority are terrified of emotion, and they've got to ask all these questions about it. A child doesn't ask questions about emotions, it feels emotions. Adults ask questions about emotion before they feel them. Yep. So the parents modelled this behaviour. Terrible thing to model, really. It causes a huge amount of terror inside of the child that it can't identify the source of. It can't identify the cause of it. It's very destructive. Now, the parents weren't happy with just doing that, though. They took an additional step, and that is they imposed upon the child in other words, they took measures, definite measures, to impose their terror of their own emotion upon the child, so the child was taught to be terrified of its own emotions, particularly when it's with the parent. Does that make sense? So now the parent is basically doing things like, and there's a lot of things that it's doing. It's using bribery and blackmail techniques to suppress the child's experience of emotion. It happens from the moment the child is born. The child starts crying. Most children start crying as soon as they're born, unfortunately. So they don't... one of my sons, Tristan, he entered the world with a bit of a smile on his face, and he never cried. But most children are not like that, right? Most instantly begin crying. And the reason why is because there's already so much imposed emotion that occurred between the time of conception and the time of birth that the child already has quite a lot to cry about. But what does the parent do? There, bottle, boob, bottle, boob, whatever it is, the choice, and dummy, to try to stop the grieving process that the child is already starting to naturally engage. The parent, through its actions, is already suppressing the child's emotion through its actions. And the feeling in the parent is that this emotion of the child is now harming me. I'm distressed by my child crying. And of course, the reason why you're distressed by your child crying is because you're distressed by your own tears you haven't felt yet. Right? So that's why you're distressed. But you're distressed by your child crying, and as a result of that, when the child cries, you feel distressed. You want to try to shut the child up. Now, many parents use what they call loving techniques to do that, which is nursing the child, feeding the child, and so forth. But still the child cries. So the child's had a feed, you've wiped its bum and done all the necessary things to make it comfortable, and yet it's still crying. What happens to the parent now? The parent's now very distressed, because the parent has a desire to suppress that kind of emotion inside of itself. And so it suppresses it in the child. So that's what a normal parent does. And it gets worse from there. Many parents, by the time the child is 1 or 2 years of age, revert to physical violence to control the child's emotions. The terrible twos, when the child starts rebelling against the parent's imposed emotional restrictions. What does the parent start doing now? It starts using bribery and threats to manipulate the behaviour of the child. Bribery in that, give it a lolly. Distract it with something nice so that it doesn't have to feel, so that I don't have to put up with whatever it is the child's feeling. Or we go into threats. You'll be in your room, you can't come out until you deal with this. Or it gets worse from there, doesn't it? Even violence. We start smacking the child for its behaviour. Right? Imposing further restrictions, and now not only further restrictions but the threat of violence, which is why many of you are so terrified of violence. It actually happened in your childhood, where people who supposedly love you and told you they loved you would frequently, or at least sometimes, revert to violence in order to control you. So is it no wonder you fear pain? Isn't it? No wonder. Yeah. Sad, huh? There's so many things that happen in that place. If you go back to and observe what a normal parent does with their child, and what we classify as normal parental behaviour, normal, loving parental behaviour, you'll see that it's all about suppression and conformity, bringing the child into a state where it conforms with the adult and with the adult's definition of what the child can allow itself to experience. And then there's some areas, of course, where the child has a fairly unrestricted allowance of its emotion. So, for example, when it starts to learn to walk, it's allowed to go through that process, where it falls over flat on its face, has a big cry, and because it's had a big cry, it's released that pain. And so what does it do next? Gets up, starts trying to walk again, as if the pain never happened. And the reason why is because it hasn't happened for that child, it's now released that pain. And so that's why most of us learn to walk. If that never happened, most of us would still be probably crawling around on our hands and knees, terrified to get up because of the imposed restrictions from our parents. But the reality is that our parents love us walking because in the end it alleviates more of their responsibilities, number one. Number two, it also is a developmental sign, a positive sign that the child is growing. And the parents love that, love to see the developmental side. So they honour those feelings in the child. So now we've got the problem where some feelings are not allowed and other feelings are allowed. And now there sets in a whole series of confusions. How do I determine, if I haven't got an intellect and I'm only going by feelings, how do I determine which feelings are allowed and which feelings are not allowed? You know the way I determine it? By what my parent feels. So if my parents feel fear or attack or anger, they're the feelings I'm not allowed. And if my parents feel good, happy, satisfied, they're the feelings I'm allowed to have. So now my feelings, without me knowing, are being manipulated and controlled by my response to my parents' emotions. Man, it's no wonder we're so confused, is it not? It's all just messed up. Now we're so confused, we don't know about our own emotions. We certainly don't honour them. Instead, what we're now taught to do is to honour our parents' emotions. That's the emotions we honour. So now our parents' emotions become our yardstick for what we're allowed to feel. It's so damaging, isn't it? Now I can't feel what I feel unless my parent allows me to feel. And can you see how controlled that makes me already? I'm already now controlled. I haven't developed my intellect to even know I'm being controlled, and yet I'm being controlled. I'm being controlled because I'm now focused on how to prevent my parents' pain and therefore my own. Now, I could go on and on about this because we can talk about this for weeks and still not fully understand the true effect of our parents' behaviour upon us as children. It's no wonder we have these. No wonder. It's no wonder that we then start to do a whole heap of things here because of this terror of feeling emotional pain. Right? So what's the next thing that happens? Well, I've been taught this from a very young age. I've been engaging this behaviour now for 6 or 7 years. Right from the time I was conceived, I had all this emotion in me, some of which I was allowed to feel, some of which I'm not. Right? And I have to learn to be selective about which one, and that will depend totally on what my environment feels about which one I'm allowed to feel and which one I am not. So now I'm in this state, aren't I, where I'm so in tune to my environment's feelings, and now I can't even feel my own feelings anymore. Does that make sense? So I'm now a child, I still don't have any real formulated idea or concept of what's happened, but I have basically been soul washed. Soul washed. Instead of brain washed, I have been soul washed. I've been taught all of these things without myself having the capacity to determine whether it's right or wrong what I've been taught. And there I am. I'm just a little child still, not knowing or understanding what's happened, but now feeling the emotional imperative to only do things under agreement or rebellion against my parent, with my parent, or against my parent's emotions. It's my only choice. I can only agree with or rebel. I can't do anything else, really. I can't have my own feelings and just feel them, except where my parents have allowed me to. Okay, so what did I do then? I'm now 6 or 7 years old. I've now got a formulated mind, formulated brain. I'm now starting to think for myself, be self-aware. I've been beginning, to learn how to develop my will, which started usually by the time I can walk. I'm starting to develop the use of my will. And now by the time I'm 6 or 7 years of age, my will is pretty well set now. But where's my will set to? My will is to avoid pain. My will is to, rather than avoid, I could use the word fear, pain. So now I'm starting to make choices and decisions. I've already been taught that feeling pain is a bad thing. It's a terrible thing. It's going to cause very bad problems in your family. And the problem with it is that your very survival depends upon you believing that. The very people who are actually helping you survive have actually imposed these restrictions. And you know that and it is true that your very survival does depend upon you accepting these restrictions. Your very survival depends on it. Because you try confronting a parent when you're a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old child. Most parents revert to violence in order to restrict your behaviour. So your very survival depends upon it. It does. In a way, your fear of pain was essential for your own survival. Can you see that? Because if you hadn't feared pain, just like your parents fear pain and just like they taught you to fear pain, then you would have been in disagreement with your parents. This was the state I was in my first century life. I was in constant disagreement with my parents emotionally. As a result of that, I got quite a lot of punishment in comparison to the normal child. Because of the disagreement. Now, I survived it, but most of you possibly would not have if the same thing had happened to yourself, given the fact that many parents are very abusive. Right? And this is why when we talk about emotions, most of you become so afraid that you feel your very survival is threatened when we start discussing emotions. Can you see? There's a link to all of these feelings that you have inside of yourself. So now what do I do? Well, you can see now that I've started to have a developed sense of my own will, it's going to be very, very difficult for me, isn't it, to actually work against my parents' quite set opinions and will until I've left home. Because while I'm in their environment, their imposition of their belief systems with regard to pain is essential for my own survival. So it's highly likely that from the age of where I've developed some intellect now, 5, 6, 7 years of age, right the way through to my teenage years, late teenage years, it's highly likely that I will either accept or rebel against my parents' choices and restrictions. If I rebel, most of you are kicked out of home if you rebel. And if I accept, then I've said to have a lovely family. And so the majority of us will be tempted to accept rather than rebel. So from the age of my developmental cycle, if you like, from the time when I'm a young child to the time that I'm a teenager, in my late teens, I have now accepted the status quo of the belief about pain, which is you must fear it. You must be terrified of it. This is how you survive. So there I am. I'm now 16, 17, 18 years of age, maybe leaving home. That's my belief. Now, can you see that it's highly unlikely, unless some awareness has come to me at some point in my future, it's highly unlikely that I will break that paradigm. Isn't it? Because it's really set. I've had 18 years of it now. It's set inside of me as a belief system. The terror is valid, is what the belief system is. The terror of emotion, the terror of pain is valid. You must avoid it at all costs. Now, the child by nature does not avoid pain. It is taught to avoid pain. Taught through a process, a very destructive process. So when I talk to you about your parents' sin, many of you still don't understand the extent of it. And one reason why you don't is because you don't understand that actually if you're a parent, you've actually imposed probably the same restrictions on the next generation. So there's automatically a blindness to these restrictions. There's a blindness to the restrictions that have been imposed because we believe they're right. We believe it's what love is. We believe that love is terrified of pain. Love avoids pain at all costs. It's a global emotional refusal of pain. Did you get that? And now I, personally, decide to live my life that way. And until some awareness occurs, so, where I actually understand that God's laws are trying to expose this particular problem that's in all humanity, until that develops, I'm going to live that way. And I might live that way 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years before I have a developing awareness that it's maybe not the way to live. The majority of people on this planet pass into the spirit world with that belief. Very few people actually deconstruct the belief on earth. You can see why. Because society and the parental system is all supporting that belief. To fit into society without being attacked and to fit into family without being attacked, you have to believe that. You have to believe that pain should be avoided at all costs. Can you start to have some compassion for yourselves about that? Lorraine, thanks.
On top of the global emotion of refusing pain, is there an additional Asian serenity on top?
What happens with different, should we call them races of people on Earth, is different, of course. So some races will have different additional problems with how they've been brought up. But what I'm suggesting here is that every single one of those things are all driven by this emotional avoidance of terror, every single one. Even the desire to maintain an outward facade of, everything's fine, is actually driven by it. Yeah. When everything's not fine. And I've been saying to many of you for years that everything's not fine, and you're going, yes, it was, yes, it was. because you have the same thing that I had, and that is the internal necessity for survival to believe what you currently believe. That's what drives it, the necessity for survival. So what do? I now fear, I now use my will. So now I'm using my will. I'll just... At all costs. I don't care what it costs me anymore. I'm using my will. I've now developed a very strong fear-based will. And this is what I'm saying to you. You don't realise it yet. Most of you do not realise that most of the questions that you ask me are driven by this very strong fear-based will. When you get rid of this very strong fear-based will, you won't even ask those questions anymore. Most questions are driven by the strong fear-based will. You think you're being logical, but actually you're being driven by fear. You think it's logical. So Patty, you'd like to?
So we have this strong fear-based will, and basically what you taught us last session
in the will discussion,
was that we have an option, free choice, to develop or discover a love-based will.
Correct. So can you see straight away that there's going to have to be something that we have to do about this fear-based will, isn't there?
Yeah.
This fear-based will is our problem.
Yeah.
It's the major thing that causes us to develop all of this above this in this diagram. All of the facade and everything above is all driven by this one underlying factor of our will being driven by fear. So you can see that our will being driven by fear is something we're going to have to address. Now, how do you release an emotion of fear? How do you release it?
Feel it.
You have to experience it.
Yeah.
And most of us do not want to experience terror.
Right, because my fear-based will is absolutely saying that's the last thing I want to do.
Correct. Correct. The very last thing the fear-based is telling you, don't do that. Above all things, don't do that. And it's the very thing you have to do in order to change, you see. And this is where our problems are. Here, not here. This is the result of this problem. This is the cause of our problem. The cause of our problem is this underlying desire to prevent the emotion of terror. It's driving everything we do. Yeah. Everything we do. Every question we ask, every decision we make is driven by the pain-pleasure motivation rather than by love and truth. And the only way to deconstruct it is the very way that this particular will says don't do. Right. And that is to feel the terror. To feel this global emotion of terror that exists within me that I don't even know what it's about, because most of it entered me before I even had a formulated intellectual idea or concept about it. And so for most of you, all you feel is just terrified contemplating it. Yeah.
I thank you for the gift of
knowing
introducing love-based will. I mean,
it's
I
one
don't
of the
get
most,
it yet, but thank you.
Yeah, it's one of the most powerful things to understand.
Yeah.
It also should give you some level of compassion for yourself. Can you see?
Yeah.
See, every time I talk about your addictions, what I feel from you is, AJ's judging us again. You know, he's criticising this again, and I know I have that. Can he just let off on that and so forth, right? That's a general feeling. Well, the feeling I actually have is compassion for your situation. And you know why? Because I can feel how it got created. It got created through a terrible sequence of events that have been applied to all humanity. And it's been going on for millennia, thousands of years. Thousands of years this has been happening. It's no wonder, isn't it, that it feels like it's set in stone within us, does it not? This terror. And we have to feel it to release it. The very thing that the terror tells us not to do. Yeah. So we come down to Ivana and up to Mary at the back.
So can we choose to just start feeling that global emotional terror, or do we have to actually start deconstructing the stuff that we've put on top?
Yes, we need to understand why this gets created now because of this, and we need to understand that the more we engage this, the less opportunity we're going to have to feel that. That's the point of this. The point of what's above this fear, the facade, the point of the facade is to deny this fear.
Yeah, so if we don't want to learn about the facade, then we've got no chance
Exactly.
really of getting anywhere.
But we need to understand that sooner or later we're going to have to feel our terror.
Yep.
Sooner or later. Sooner or later, that's the key. While that terror exists, I am going to create sin. I'm going to always make decisions based upon how terrified I am, rather than based upon love and truth. While that fear exists in me. While I'm so terrified of feeling pain, I am going to create sin. Guaranteed. And I need to understand that. Yep. I need to get that. Yep. And that, of course, triggers, if we could write down here, it triggers my addictions. So now I engage a whole series of addictions, which you can see on the diagram over here, is now in this area here. And then on top of that, I can engage other things like denial, even above that, in order to avoid the fact that this is happening. And it's all happening up here now. And my addictions are like vortexes of need, like that. To use the word needy is like insufficient, isn't it? They're like screaming demands at me, aren't they? That is screaming at you. You got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this. And so off you go and do it, And then you're, oh boy, that wasn't very good. More pain. But next time the situation comes up, I've got to do it, I've got to do it, I've got to do it. You're back into the same vortex because the fear, the terror is driving everything. And this terror is so unformulated within you and so childlike in its nature, in the way that it operates, that you're not even thinking before you're doing. And we have to deconstruct it somehow. Does that make sense? But before we get to deconstructing it, we need to understand it. We need to accept it. We need to understand it. We need to get it. We need to sort of understand what creates all of our problems.